Good evening, everybody. My name's Fiona Macpherson, and I'll be hosting this evening's event. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Open University to our webinar on managing conflict at work. On today's session, we've got Janet Barker from the Open University, who's providing support in the background, and we've got Dave Barrett, who will be presenting on behalf of Career Farm. Before we start, I'd like you to familiarise yourself with WebEx if you haven't used it before. I know many of you probably have, but for those of you that haven't, I'm just going to navigate you around the screen just so you can familiarise yourself. As you'll see in the main part of the screen, this actually displays any content, and as you can see at the moment, we've got a presentation there, and that's all we're using today, so anything that you view will be shown in that part of the screen. At the top of your screen, you'll see an audio broadcast box, and this is where you can actually adjust the volume. So if you can't hear very well, if you want to adjust on there, that'd be great. Then on the right-hand side of your screen, we have the participant tab and the Q&A tab. You also have a chat tab, but we would prefer if you don't use that for any question and answer sessions because we won't actually be monitoring that. So when we actually come on to the question and answer session, please use the Q&A tab to submit your questions and any answers, because Dave will be asking some questions as we go along. So first of all, we're just going to have a practice just so that you can familiarise yourself with how to use the participant tab and also the Q&A tab. So if you want to select the participant panel, if you haven't already done so, then go down to the bottom and first of all just click on the show hand icon. Brilliant. Okay, so at some point Dave might ask for a show of hands to a particular question, and that's how you would actually do that. So that's quite a useful function. Okay, brilliant. That's great, everybody. Okay, you'll also see next to that icon is an icon with a tick, and there's a number of different feedback options that you've got there, yes, no, etc. So if you want to just use the tick icon, and I want you to answer the following question with either a yes or no, just familiarise yourself with that. So the question is, have you attended a webinar before? That's great. Okay, so that's how you would actually use that function. So Dave might ask you a closed question where you can give a yes or a no answer. Okay. And next we're going to look at the Q&A panel. So if you want to click on that. In order to send a question, all you need to do is select panelist from the Ask drop-down menu, type in your question and click on send, and we'll answer as many as we can. Dave will actually be taking breaks at certain points during the session, and we can take some questions as we go along if you have anything. And also he's allowed some time towards the end for some more questions, so he'll let you know when that's coming up so you can actually start sending your questions through. So just to have a quick practice, if you want to select panelist from the menu, and then just type in whereabouts you are geographically today and click on send. That's great. We've got Kirsten in Berlin, Peter in Andover, Angela in Buckinghamshire. Oh, we've got people all over the place. John in Bucharest, Tom in Basel, Eva in Munich, Lorna in Ireland. That's brilliant. So that essentially that's how you use the Q&A panel. And as I said, Dave will actually ask some questions as we go along. So you can put your answers in there and actually send those through so that you can see your answers. And again, if you have a question, obviously submit it through there. That's great, guys. So use that. At the end of the session, there is actually a short feedback questionnaire as well, which will pop up, and we'd really appreciate you to take a couple of minutes just to give us your feedback on today's session. That'd be great. So I'm now going to pass you over to our presenter, Dave Barrett, so that he can introduce himself. Just bear with me a second. Okay, Dave, you've got control.
Okay, good evening everybody. Thank you, Fiona, for that great introduction. My name's Dave Barrett. I work for a company, which is my own company, called Turning Moment, and working with Career Farm this evening in conjunction with the Open University. I have had many years' experience in helping people deal with conflict and disagreement in the workplace, and the majority of my work now is mediating between groups and individuals. So what I want to do with you this evening is just take you through some of the things that I've learnt and come across over the years in terms of managing disagreement effectively in the workplace. And all of the things that I'm going to be talking about are based on general principles of how people interact when they're in the workplace. So some of this may transfer into other contexts, but mostly it will be talking about disagreement in the workplace. So you should have a slide in front of you, managing disagreement effectively. We're now going to move on to the next slide, which should be, excuse me, just lost my place here. Yeah, so the next slide is the three areas that we're going to be covering in the session. So what you should have in front of you is a picture of a capuchin monkey with what is disagreement, how you may react, and some simple tools. So they're the three basic areas we're going to cover in the next 50 minutes or so. So we're going to have a bit of an exploration first around what disagreement is and some of the definitions of that. And then we're going to talk about how people may react in disagreement situations. And people often find this quite surprising because there's some things that people are often in control of in disagreement situations, and there are other things that they're less in control of. So that might be of interest to people. And then finally, we're going to look at some very simple things you can do to manage disagreement more effectively. So we've got a few processy type things we can talk through. Okay, so I'd just like you to think about successful relationships for a moment. I've just on the screen here we have a picture of a Costa Rican fisherman, and you can see at the other end of the boat is a bird called a tiger heron, and you can see these two are in harmony. The fisherman looks happy and the tiger heron looks happy. And what I'd like you to just do via the Q&A panel is have a think about what makes a successful relationship, and then just bung some ideas on the Q&A panel about what you actually think makes a relationship work and what makes a successful relationship. So I'll just give you a few seconds to think about that. And just while you're doing that, just think about the kind of normal situation between fishermen and birds where they may actually be in conflict, and what is it about the situation that's making those actually be in harmony with each other. So we've got some great things coming through already. We've got Helmut, who's talking about trust, respect and transparency, calmness, common appreciation, compromise. Yeah, some very, very good stuff coming through here. Symbiotic relationship we've got here, respect, openness. We'll talk more about openness because that's an interesting one. Openness again, the need to understand the situation, understanding others' objectives, collaboration, cooperation and mutual communication, understanding each other's needs. All basic stuff which is all on the right sort of lines. There's some fantastic stuff coming through here. So I've summarized some of the key things that when I'm dealing with people, particularly in mediation sessions, what tends to come through. And In terms of making relationships work, these 4 tend to be things that come up time and time again and repeat themselves consistently. So the first one is showing empathy, and empathy is very different from sympathy in terms that empathy is about understanding another person's position and another person's point of view, but you may not necessarily agree with that. So that's very important to understand, that we can understand another person's position, but we might not necessarily need to agree with it. And true empathy is essentially putting yourself in somebody else's shoes so you can see things from their perspective. What I also see in positive relationships is a clear focus on needs and interests, and we're going to actually look at needs and interests in more detail in a bit. But essentially, it's focusing on what people want to get out of the relationship, or what they're trying to achieve through the relationship. And I think that can be very important. And kind of linked into that is focus more on the long term. And what I notice happens often in disagreement, people become very fixated on short-term gains and short-term objectives and the immediacy of the situation, and I'll explain in a bit why that happens, because it's something to do with the way that people begin to interact when they're in a disagreement. So positive relationships focus more on long-term aims rather than short-term ones. And then finally, a sort of commitment really around to make things work. People take action, so when things aren't working, they will actually do something about it quite quickly to make sure that it does work. So empathy, focusing on needs and interests, focusing more on the long term, and action. So we'll explore those in a bit more depth. I've got another question for you actually, which I think is quite a critical one. And I just want to ask you again, if we can just bung some things down, pass some things through the Q&A panel, what you think disagreement or conflict actually is, a definition of it. So just some thoughts there, if you can quickly just pass those through to us as we're talking. So just looking, so we've got opposing views coming through, force, demonstration, position. Position's a great word actually, that's a very important word in conflict and disagreement resolution. Opposing points of view on a subject, having a different point of view, different objectives. So some great stuff. So depending on what you read about conflict, so there are many books on conflict resolution and managing disagreement. There are all sorts of definitions, but I just want to bring your attention to a few of the key ones. And this needs and interests thing is very, very important in managing disagreement. And in terms of what you remember from the session today, if you take away just this one thing other than anything else, that will help you in any situation that you find yourself where you're having to manage a disagreement, and that is the ability to understand whether somebody's needs or interests are being met or not. And interests tend to be things that people are motivated by, and needs are very similar. So what is it that I'm wanting to achieve in the situation? And often these are not being met in some way, and then people express this in different ways. The other thing that we have in terms of disagreement is a different or incompatible ideas and thoughts and thinking about the same thing. Finally, people adopting positions, and I think somebody mentioned that in terms of what came through on the Q&A stuff. And positions is has a particular meaning in conflict resolution. So a position is what we call a first level disagreement. It's where people tend to just focus on what their view is rather than thinking about other things. And to help you understand this, I just want to tell you a very quick story about two sisters who were arguing over an orange, and both of them wanted the orange, and the position that they adopt adopted over the orange is I'm having all of the orange. And they ended up in this place of arguing over the orange. And as the argument progressed, they progressively became more angry and became stronger in their position in terms of wanting the orange. And eventually they agreed that the only way out of the situation would be to cut the orange in half. So that's what they did. And after they'd finished the argument and gone their separate ways, they met up again a few days later and they talked about the argument and they explored the argument and what happened in the argument. And interestingly, what they found out was if they'd have spent more time thinking about what they actually needed and focusing on needs and interests rather than positions, they would have realized that one sister wanted the orange for its peel to do some cooking with, and the other sister wanted the orange for its juice to have a drink with. And that nicely summarizes the difference between positions and needs and interests, that they both could have had all of the orange if they'd have spent a bit more time focusing on needs and interests rather than the position that they'd adopted. I think the final thing which is really important in disagreement is it's something that I see time and time again, that it's often viewed as negative, and it's something that most people are very afraid of, and in some cases to the point of being scared of disagreement and will avoid it. Something that I just want to sow in your minds is that some of the most productive relationships and teams and groups that work well together experience quite a lot of disagreement, and it's an important part of developing relationships. So where possible, as long as it's what we call healthy disagreement, and we'll talk about the difference between healthy and unhealthy disagreement in a moment, it can be very positive. But most people's default position is that disagreement is often viewed as negative. So they're kind of the key things that I see at a top line level that would kind of give us a bit of a definition around disagreement. So what sort of things do you think we disagree about? So again, via the Q&A panel, if you can just bung a few thoughts down about the sorts of things that we're likely to disagree about, that would be very, very interesting just to see those just coming through. So some things that are coming through now, territorial threats, the way forward for a group, values and standards and objectives, situation, fiscal stuff, so money, politics, interpretation, resource allocation, responsibilities, workload. And that really sums up in quite a nice way the range of things that people disagree about. But the nice thing, in a way, for me as a mediator who has daily contact with people who are in disagreement or in conflict, is I start to see patterns emerge. And there are two basic ways in which people disagree. And the first one is what I call superficial ways. So they're kind of processy ways. They're the ways that people go about things. And then there's more fundamental ways which tend to be more serious. So we'll just look at the sort of more superficial ways first. And these tend to be the patterns that underlie the content of what people disagree about. So the first one, so the slide is kind of representing the size of the text, the things that we tend to deal with most. So fast and slow is the most common one. And essentially what that means is the speed with which people work or the speed with which they think about things. So one person will want to do something quickly, the other person will want to do it slowly. Another person may want to think things through in a very quick and snappy way. Another person will want to think more slowly about things. They need to reflect and take things away to think about them. And in terms of all the people that I deal with, this one is very, very common in terms of what people get into disagreement about. So a fast person will be frustrated and irritated by a slow person, and a slow person will feel dragged along by a fast person. And both these kind of styles have lots of value. They both have things that are useful, and they both have things that are less useful. So proactive and reactive. So people who tend to think ahead and deal with things as they sort of almost planning and thinking about the future, seeing things coming, whereas people who tend to wait and sit back and react to things. And that can be particularly in some work environments where you've got someone who's very organized and somebody who's less organized. They can drive each other to distraction, and again that can lead to frustration and disagreement. Now I can see a question coming through. Do we mean efficient and inefficient rather than fast and slow? And that's a really good question. That could be part of it. Thanks, Richard, for that question, because that's really good. What I'm really talking about here is the pace with which people go about things, either in their head or in terms of behaviour. Yeah. So if you think about somebody that it might be yourself or somebody you know who is very mobile, they kind of move on different things and do things quickly, and maybe somebody else you know who tends to take a more methodical approach to things, a more steady approach to things. So it's about the pace with which people work or think about things. And it's not to do with intelligence. I know some extremely clever people who approach things in a steady fashion or a slow way, and vice versa. So thanks for that. It's a great question. The next one that I see is what I call approximate and precise. So somebody who is happy with things sort of being rough and ready, and other people who need it to be quite accurate. And that can be around time, or it can be around things that people are working on. So both are relevant here. And time management is something that people find very, very difficult and can often lead to quite difficult, complex situations. The other thing is what I call polishing. So whether somebody spends too much time making things just right, that can be very frustrating for somebody who wants to get things done. So both have value and both have limitation. And then the final one, which I've described as people and things, but another way of thinking about this is what we call emotion, which is more about people and feelings, and then the things are more objectivity and reality. So people who have strong feelings, or we all have strong feelings, but particularly some people will react to feelings and put feelings first, whereas other people may be more focused on objective type things and more concrete type things. And again, that can be a source of disagreement between people. So I'd just like to give you a second while we move on to think about yourself in that context and whether any of those things that I've just talked about make any sense to you. So if there are any thoughts, if anybody makes any connections with any of those, do bung them through or pass them through on the Q&A panel as I'm talking. So they're what I call the kind of superficial things, and then there's some more fundamental ways in which people disagree. And what I find about the things that we've just talked about, they are things that are, in some ways, if you deal with them quickly enough, you can deal with quite quickly, and you can deal with relatively easily, and they can often be fixed with the right sort of intervention and support, or if they're dealt with early on. When we start getting into this kind of area, which is around values, beliefs and interests, these tend to be more fundamental disagreements. And I think these tend to lead to more what I call protracted, so long-term disagreements. So values are things that are important to us, and they tend to be very deep-seated. So a quick way of surfacing your values is to think about the things that might irritate you or make you cross, and we call these value violations. So I find that quite a helpful way to maybe think about the values that I find frustrating. So one of my strong values is about time. It's important to me that people turn up to meetings on time, and that's very important to me when I'm dealing with people at work. So that's a strong value for me. Beliefs are slightly different. Beliefs are what people place trust and faith in. They're things that people believe to be true. So they're slightly different from values, but they can be confused by people quite easily. And people may have very strong beliefs around certain things, and I think what you can find is that if people have strong beliefs or beliefs that they find hard to change, that can be, again, a strong source of disagreement between individuals. And the final one is interest, and we've already talked about interest. So they're the things that people feel motivated by and want to get out of situations. And what I find is that if people have these disregarded or trampled over or ignored, it can lead to very deep level emotional frustration or people feeling hurt by the other parties that are involved. So it's very important to differentiate between these two types of disagreement. So the superficial stuff, which we talked about, the fast, slow, that kind of thing, which are easier to deal with, and then the more fundamental type of disagreement, which is around values, beliefs, and interests. So it can be quite useful to just think about, if you experience disagreement with an individual, what type of disagreement you might be experiencing. Yeah, whether it's a more fundamental one or whether it's something a bit easier to deal with. So what happens when we get into a disagreement with somebody? Well, this is quite interesting, and what happens is we get locked into a very primitive automatic response. So what happens is most people will see a potential disagreement as a potential threat, and this is something that stems back way back in time. It's something that's been with us for thousands and thousands of years and is part of our early history as early human beings. And it's called the fight or flight response. And essentially, whenever we experience a potential threat, chemicals are released into our bloodstream. And when those chemicals are released, it starts to initiate a particular response. And the purpose of this is to protect us. So its kind of initial kind of purpose in thousands and thousands of years ago was to keep us safe from harm. And what happens is it heightens our awareness. Things like our ability to notice things, our pupils dilate, our brain becomes more active, we notice more, we become more stimulated, so we become ready to do something. And also people will often feel butterflies in their tummy, and what's happening there is blood is being diverted from the stomach into the muscles, ready for either a fight or running away from the situation. So what can happen to people when they get into a disagreement, and particularly a serious disagreement, this automatic and natural process kicks in, and people become very quickly subsumed by the chemicals in their bloodstream. And this is why it can be extremely difficult for some people to deal with disagreement objectively. And when I opened the session, I talked about some things we can be in control of and some things we can't in a disagreement or a conflict. So we call this being in the grip of the chemicals. So if you're dealing with somebody who you suspect is in the grip of the chemical. So they might be shaking, they might be angry. So anger is a sign that somebody is in the grip of their chemicals, that kind of thing. An important thing to recognize and realize is that they have probably lost control to some extent of how they will react. And trying to deal with the person when they're in that state, then it's really important to recognize that you might have to wait for the chemical reaction to pass. Now, in some people that can be a few minutes, in other people that can be several hours. So it's very, very important to understand that trying to deal with people when we call what we call being in the grip of the chemicals is not a good idea. So just thinking about that can be very helpful, and you may have recognized it yourself if you've experienced a situation where you've had to give a presentation, or you've had to do something that you find scary, or you've actually experienced conflict yourself. You may have been in the grip of the chemicals within your own kind of stuff. Linda's just sent through something about, she just asked tearful, and I think that's absolutely right. People will respond to this chemical reaction in many, many ways, okay? So very important to understand that. Tearful is one of them, anger, fear, a whole range of emotional responses. So recognizing that can be very helpful. So how do we deal with this then? So let's move into some things that we can start to think about. A very simple model is what we call stimulus and response. So the person is stimulated by a particular thing that begins to upset them or they disagree with. And the objective is to understand how they're likely to deal with that. And what you then would get is a response of some kind of behavioral response. But in between that, they go through a process. And there are two ways that people tend to think about things. They either become what we call active, so they will engage in the situation, and they may engage positively, as you can see by the A there, or they may engage negatively. And what that means for a positive engagement will be that they will try to resolve the situation in a positive, active way. And it will be obvious to you that that's what they're trying to do. A negative active engagement is somebody starting to become aggressive or something like that. The other way that people do it is what we call a passive response, and that can be described as avoidance in a way, really. That's another way of describing it. So the flight side, and they can do that in a positive way. So often if people are giving a passive thinking here, what they want to do is they want to think about something, they want to take it away and reflect on it and then come back. So sometimes people may not want to deal with something there and then. They may need to go away in a passive way and think about it. So that's a positive way of dealing with it. A more negative passive response is to bear grudges or to seek revenge, that kind of thing. So what you often find is people will come at it indirectly, so they'll come back at the individual and do something more indirect, so what I call guerrilla warfare. So they can undermine in meetings or make little comments, sarcasm, that kind of thing is what I would describe as passive negative responses. So just a word about dealing with disagreement yourselves. So when I've done work with people, they often want to have a go at stuff themselves, which I would actively encourage in terms of actively encouraging you to work on disagreements that you experience. But it's a very important thing that you keep yourself safe, okay? And this model is very helpful in terms of helping you just assess a situation. So there are three things to take into account when you're in a disagreement. The first one is your environment. And there's some very simple things you can do to make sure that your environment doesn't become a limitation. The most important thing that I say to people is that they are able to leave the situation if they're unhappy. So a simple thing you can look at, for example, is if there's a desk in the room, you're one side of the desk and the other person's the other side of the desk, and the desk becomes a barrier to you actually leaving the situation. Or you have to get past the person that you're having a disagreement with in order to get to the door. It's just very simple things like that. If you're anticipating or beginning to experience some form of disagreement, then you need to put yourself in a position where if things are not going the way you want, you can just leave the situation. The second thing is them, so your awareness of them, and very rarely people become angry or aggressive or angry or aggressive just all of a sudden. They build up to it. And if you want to see somebody doing this online, there's a video you can watch called Adam Bolton versus Alistair Campbell. It's a YouTube clip, and Alistair Campbell was a Labour Party representative, and Adam Bolton works for Sky News, and they have a very aggressive argument on the TV over a political issue on back in a couple of years ago. So just have a look at that. That's online on YouTube, Adam Bolton versus Alistair Campbell, and that gives you, it's about 6 minutes, that gives you a very good insight to how people can build up into a disagreement. So just watching how people respond. So if people start to become fidgety, agitated, you will see the signs of that much earlier, and again, it's about leaving before that happens. And then finally, yourself, focusing on yourself. If you're feeling uncomfortable or you're feeling worried, then my advice and counsel is that you always leave the situation and just apologize, always be polite and say, I'd like to come back to this another time. So please make it safe, and in terms of keeping yourself safe, just think about these kind of things. What are the risks? So we looked at the stuff around the desk, that kind of thing. Okay, so just thinking about your environment, what risks your environment might pose, where's the door, that kind of stuff. How do you control potential risks? So making sure you can actually get out of the room if you need to. Simple things like making sure you have mobile phone reception, that kind of thing, and making sure if you need to, you can leave. So there's some just basic things that if you're finding yourself into a disagreement situation, you can actually leave it safely. And I will just re-emphasize this more than anything. If you're unhappy, just leave. Don't question, don't worry about it. The important thing is that you leave the situation. Okay. This is an acronym for a model that I use, a process that I use to help people think about disagreement. And one of the things that can be very difficult for people when they're in disagreement situation is they're overtaken by those chemicals, as we were talking about earlier. So it can be hard for them to think clearly in the situation. So a process, a simple process, can be very useful for organizing your thoughts. And this one I use is called the WISE response. And essentially, it's about putting this in between the stimulus and the response. So when you start to experience a disagreement with somebody, or you think a disagreement is going to occur, these four things can just help you think about it in a kind of process. And the first part of the process is to actually just stand back and think about what's going on. Yeah, what are the issues? What am I observing? What is happening? What is the person talking about? What am I talking about? That kind of thing. The next thing, which is really important, and if you can just reflect on the story about the two sisters over the orange, is focus on interests rather than positions. So people will tend to focus on positions first and stick in them. So by asking a few questions, going a bit deeper. So just tell me a bit more about that as an example of a question you can use. Yeah. And then support people to reflect. And that might be at the time that you're discussing it, or it might be you need to go away and reflect about things and come back to it. So those two middle things, the I and the S there of the process, identify and support, are critical. And spending time on those things, so trying to get under the surface of what's going on, trying to identify interests and needs, and then supporting yourself and others to reflect properly on what you've come up with is critical. And then finally, encourage and support positive action. So that's what can we do. And if you remember, the thing that contributes best to longer-term relationships, successful long-term relationships, is focus on the long term. So thinking about actions in terms of what's the long term that I'm trying to achieve here, what's the objective in the long term that I want to get out of this relationship, and that will determine whether you actually do something or not. So if, as an example, often people will say something and that will be to the detriment of long-term objectives. And I think on the Q&A panel someone talked about the honesty as a positive thing in terms of good relationships, and I think that's right. But if you think about it, if you're honest about everything, that may not support everything you need to do in terms of developing a strong long-term relationship. So what I encourage people to do is, if you're going to say something to somebody, always ask the question, will this support the long-term objective I want from the relationship or not, before I say it, and that can be quite a useful thing to do. This next one is extremely helpful. It's very, very simple. It comes from an area of psychotherapy called transactional analysis, and we call this the drama triangle. And the drama triangle, in my experience, exists in most situations that I encounter, particularly if there are more than two people. So where you have a situation where you have three people engaged in a discussion or an interaction or a project or a piece of work, I can pretty much be confident within 90% that the drama triangle will start to play out. And the drama triangle basically has three roles, and the three people adopt a role. So you have a persecutor, a rescuer, and a victim. And what tends to happen is rescuers believe and adopt a role that they have to help, and they either have to help the situation or the people involved in it. Persecutors believe that something is happening that they're unhappy with, so they have to express that in some way, and they may do that either to the rescuer or the victim. And victims believe that they need help or support, or that they can't resolve the situation for themselves. So what you find is the persecutor and the victim interact, and then the rescuer steps in to help. And this is where this becomes very, very helpful, because what will happen as this situation progresses, everybody plays all of the roles. And I'm sure you can think about times where you've stepped into a situation in the belief that you're being helpful, and then you suddenly ended up feeling like you're a victim in that situation. It's kind of turned back on you. And that's the drama triangle playing. So what can be very helpful to do is, before you get into a situation, is think about, is this possibly a drama triangle situation? Richard, you've thrown up a question, how a line manager fits in this triangle. So quite often I find line managers fit nicely, and what can often happen is you've got a line report who is the victim, you've got the line manager who's the persecutor, and then you've got a third person who's trying to help the situation. Someone from the HR team, or a coach, or something like that. That can often be quite common sort of dynamic that goes on. So what happens is the roles switch around in that kind of situation, and everybody feels. So I've been in situations where, as a mediator, where I've tried to help the persecutor and victim and ended up being a victim myself. So the key thing is, for managing these kind of relationships, is recognizing that there's potential for a game. And whenever there's three people involved, there is always potential for a game. And the way to break this down is to not play. So allow people to solve their own problems. Yeah. So if you believe somebody needs help, you may start to help them, but you may need to think about whether you carry on helping them, because that can then lead to this drama triangle. So it's important to think about that. The other one is if you're experiencing behavior which you're finding difficult. And we call this desking. It's a very simple thing that you can do with a person. It's describe in matter-of-fact terms the behavior that you're experiencing. So not focusing on the person and personal stuff, but the behavior that you observe and hear from the person. So I noticed what you did was this. You then explain how that's made you feel, and what that has done has made me feel like this. You then show empathy, and I know that you're really committed to this, but I would like you to be different. You ask for a change, which is the final one. And what I would prefer is if you behave like this. So you describe the behavior that you're observing or hearing. You explain the impact on you. So you don't say, you are doing this to me. You would say something like, the impact of this behavior is making me feel like this, or I'm feeling like this. So you're describing how you're feeling. You would then show empathy for the person. I understand your position. However, this is the change I would like to see, and you ask for what you want instead of what you're getting in terms of the behavior. So that's a very simple little model just to manage people who are behaving in a way that you're finding difficult. Linda, you made a great point there. I always use my feelings as the other person cannot take them away from me. They are mine, and that is absolutely right. So if you explain how you feel, they can't argue with that. That's absolutely right, and that's a great technique for managing disagreement. Okay. So just a quick reminder. The other key process that I talked about was the wise response, and for me that is this is a thing that I use on a daily basis. So just as a reminder, you'll get a situation where people experience some kind of stimulus. They are likely to go into some kind of process, and that might be the chemical process that we talked about, or you may have an opportunity to then start to think about the issues and work out the issues, and that's the most important step. What's going on here? What's happening here? Taking a step back, focusing on interests rather than positions, the two sisters and the orange, supporting reflection, so not getting to actions and conclusions too quickly. That's often the mistake that people will make. They will try to come up with a solution quickly, and often it can be just helpful to step back and take your time before you decide on what you're going to do. And then finally, encourage positive action. Okay. We talked about what makes a successful relationship, and just going back to our two friends in the boat. If you remember, the key things from my perspective in terms of what I see on a daily basis in the work that I do, empathy is a key area, focusing on needs and interests rather than positions, and focusing more on the long term. And that long term thing is critical. So a really good, powerful question to ask yourself is, if you're in a disagreement situation with somebody, or you're finding somebody difficult to deal with, is what do I need to get in the long term from this relationship? And it will be, if I'm coaching somebody to deal with a disagreement, that will be the first question I ask them. What do you want to get out of the relationship? What is it that you're trying to achieve? So rather than getting locked into a dynamic within the individual, just stepping out of the situation and asking yourself that question can be very, very powerful. What that then does is give you a bit of a framework to decide how you intervene. So you can make decisions about whether what you say next is going to add to the long-term objective or take away from it. And then finally, what I find with positive relationships is that they actively do things to to keep the relationship positive. So they notice things much earlier than other people that things are not going well, or they need to take action to keep things on track. So hopefully in the session this evening we've covered enough ground to give you a better handle on what disagreement is. We've talked about the two types of disagreement, what I call the superficial stuff around fast and slow, proactive, reactive, approximate, precise, people and things, that kind of thing. And then the more deeper level stuff, which are the more fundamental disagreements, which tend to be stronger and deeper for people, and that tends to be more around values and beliefs and interests. So again, just reminding you that it can be extremely helpful for you to decide and think about what sort of disagreement might be going on if you happen to be involved in something like that, or you're observing something like that going on. And then some of the simple tools that we talked about, the WISE model, again, work out the issues, identify interests, support reflection and encourage action. We talked about the drama triangle with the three roles, the persecutor, victim and rescuer. And again, I would recommend that you go online and have a look at the drama triangle. If you type in anything to do with transactional analysis and drama triangle, there's loads of information online about how the drama triangle works, and that's a very, very useful tool that will help you in many, many daily situations. And then the final one we looked at was the desk, which was dealing with behavior that you're finding difficult, and that's describe what you see, explain how that makes you feel, show empathy for the other person, but then ask for the change that you want to see. So just as a sort of final thing really, what I'd like you to think about as a result of what you've heard this evening, and I really wanted to thank people for the contributions that they've made. There's been some great questions, and I'll deal with some of these as we get going in a minute. But I want you to begin from now, but also after the sessions, maybe think about one thing you could start doing differently as a result of what you've heard, one thing that you could stop doing as a result of what you've heard and we've discussed this evening, and one thing that you can carry on doing. So a bit of a three-point action plan. So something that you would start doing, something that you would stop doing, and something that you would continue doing. So I think they're kind of the main things that I wanted to just pass on to you this evening. So questions really, and Fiona, I don't know how you want to deal with those, but is it just a case of reading them off?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're actually seeing them all anyway as they're coming through. So if people you want to have a look. Just in the meantime, while you're thinking about your questions for David, would you mind just passing over the presenter to me? I just want to just give them some details about our next session coming up in March. So that's great.
Is that okay?
Yep, that's lovely. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, guys, just before we go into those questions, we have a session on the 22nd of March, which is actually based around personal branding. There's some further information there, obviously, for you. But I would say Janet's actually informing today that it's nearly booked up. There are a few places left, but it's already proved very popular. So if you are interested in attending, if you can contact Janet, she can give you the details, or obviously visit the website, but places are now limited, just for your information. Just hand you back over to Dave if you want to pick out some of those questions.
Yeah, sure. So some really good ones actually, and I'm going to struggle to get them all in the time we've got, but I'll just pick out a few that stand out. So, Richard, you say, for me, the victim suggests someone who's been wronged. Being wrong may be the perception of others, but not necessarily the victim. And I think it's important to recognize that the victim has a special meaning in terms of the drama triangle. So essentially what a victim means in the context of the drama triangle is somebody who believes that they need help from another person, or they are being persecuted by another person. It doesn't necessarily mean that they feel they're being wronged, although that can be part of it, but it tends to be that they tend to want or need something from somebody else, and either the rescuer gives them that interaction through trying to be helpful, or the persecutor can give them that by forcing things on them, and that's how it tends to work. So maybe that will be helpful to think of it in that way. I'm just reading one here from Robert Griggs. Is there anything you will do differently when working with groups and teams rather than individuals? And that's a great question, Robert. Yeah, there is. There's kind of three ways that I deal with people in terms of helping them deal with conflict. So in a one-to-one situation, often what that means is that so for mediation to work, people need to be willing volunteers to want to resolve the situation. So often where you find yourself is when you first meet people that they are unsure about whether mediation will help them. So you kind of have to coach them a little bit and get them into a place where they feel ready and able to work on the disagreement. There are some situations where either one or both parties don't want to do that. They don't want to actually work on it together. They want to work on it individually. So, and that can be particularly in situations where the conflict is protracted. So I will work with individuals to help them develop a different mindset. And over time what we find is that they then get into a place where they can feel able to manage that conflict more effectively. In a team situation, it gets more complicated because what you get is, without going into too much detail, is a dynamic called groupthink, where the group starts to alter how people behave in the group, and they will behave differently outside of the group, so they become different in group situations. So what we do and what we find is people feel less able to be open about things they're worried about in a group situation, particularly conflict. So the most critical thing in group situations is making and helping people feel able and safe to make a contribution, and that's the most important thing to help them start to move forward. So I don't know whether that helps give a bit of background to that. What else have we got? Richard, you've asked another question here. Person A is slow. Person B, the line manager, reacts by involving her manager, person C. Person A dislikes both person C. Which is the victim? Well, interestingly, at some point, if we follow the drama triangle to its fruition through all the stages, person A, person B, and person C will all be the victim at some point. Person A, person B, person C will all be the rescuer, and person A, person B, and person C will all be the persecutor. So the way that the drama triangle plays out over time is that all people involved in the game or the drama play all of the roles, and that's one of the key things to recognize. I think there's time for one more point probably. Just have a read through here. So from Helmut Buss, for me it's always interesting to get to know models to communicate to audiences for people to behave as they behave. Thanks for the models you have shared. How applicable are they in multicultural environments? Do they work in China as they may work in Europe? That's such a great question, and unfortunately I haven't had time to go into the impacts of culture. Culture is a very important part of conflict disagreement, and I think that the models that I've shared with you this evening are much more associated with Western cultures than they are more Eastern ones. And I think it is important to just say that people in different parts of the world may react differently to how these models are applied. So it's not something that I've personally had a great deal of experience of working multiculturally in different parts of the world in conflict. My experience is mainly in the UK and a bit in Europe, so they're kind of the key things. So that brings us to 7 o'clock.